You have been told a lie every time you reached for a packet of yeast. The tiny granules in that foil pouch have existed for roughly 160 years. That is it. But humans baked leavened bread for 6,000 years before Fleischmann's ever sold a single cake. Which raises a question you have probably never asked. What was making the bread rise? The answer is still floating in the air around you right now, and it has been hiding in the back of your own refrigerator for decades without you ever knowing it. This invisible baker is wild yeast. For 6,000 years, every loaf on Earth rose because of it. You don't need a lab to capture it. Just flour, water, and the knowledge that the microbes that leavened Pharaoh's bread are alive in your kitchen right now. And here is what nobody tells you. The hardest step is not science. It is patience. Because you are about to rebuild a relationship that a foil packet stole from you. 6,000 years ago, in the bakeries of ancient Egypt, someone made a mistake that would change the human diet forever. They left a bowl of flour and water uncovered. By morning, the mixture had bubbled, risen, and smelled curiously sour. Instead of throwing it out, they baked it. The bread that came out of that oven was lighter, softer, and more digestible than anything they had ever eaten. They did not know that wild yeast spores floating in the air had landed in that bowl and multiplied. They only knew that the loaf tasted like life itself. So they saved a piece of the wet dough, fed it more flour and water, and used it again the next day. That scrap of fermented dough, a sourdough starter, became an inheritance. Grandmother to granddaughter, baker to apprentice, town to town. Every civilization from Sumeria to Rome built its bread on the backs of invisible microbes that lived in the flour, the air, and the hands of those who needed it. And then, in 1857, Louis Pasteur placed a sample of leavening under a microscope and illuminated what had been invisible since the pharaohs. Fermentation was not chemistry. It was biology. Living organisms, yeast and bacteria, were doing the work. The discovery made it possible to isolate Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the single strongest fermenting strain, and grow it in vats. In 1868, the Fleischmann brothers in Cincinnati introduced America to the world's first commercial yeast cake, a compressed block of pure Saccharomyces. The promise was seductive. With commercial yeast, bread rose in 2 hours instead of 12. There were no sour surprises. No need to feed a living crock daily. By the early 1900s, recipes no longer mentioned sourdough. A 6,000-year-old living tradition was swapped for a foil packet in a single generation. Almost. Because one bakery in San Francisco refused to let go. In 1849, Isidore Boudin opened a shop and borrowed a wild yeast starter from gold miners. That same culture, fed flour and water every single day, is still alive behind his bakery's doors. 170 years of continuous life through 2 world wars and the wholesale abandonment of wild yeast by an entire nation. Boudin's starter is proof that a wild culture, once built, outlives the men who build it. And this is where the story collides with your kitchen. Because hidden beneath the surface of every sourdough starter is a lopsided war, and the number that governs who wins is 100 to 1. Lactic acid bacteria outnumber yeast cells in a mature sourdough starter by roughly 100 to 1. That ratio is not random. It is the difference between a starter that doubles in 4 hours and one that does nothing for a week and molds. Most home bakers fail because they fight that ratio instead of feeding it. And in a few minutes, I am going to show you exactly how to tip the scales. Exactly how to tip the scales. Because when you mix flour and water together and leave it on the counter, You are not inventing anything. You are inviting something. The flour itself carries the seed. Wild yeast spores cling to every wheat grain in the field. When those grains are milled, the spores ride into the bag you buy at the store. Add water, and they wake up. But here is the part. No cookbook tells you clearly. Yeast starts slow. Bacteria start fast. Within the first 24 hours, your jar will bubble and swell. You will think you have won. You have not. That first burst of activity is almost entirely leuconostoc bacteria, not yeast. They produce carbon dioxide just like yeast, which creates foam and rise, but they also produce acetic acid, the sharp vinegar tang. If you bake with that culture on day 2, your bread will be dense and sour in a way that makes your jaw clench. Novice bakers smell the tang, panic, and throw the entire jar into the trash. They just killed the very ecosystem they needed, because leuconostoc is temporary. As the mixture acidifies, the leuconostoc dies back, and a different species takes over. Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis. That is the bacterium named after San Francisco sourdough, but it lives in flour everywhere on Earth. And it is the discovery that turns your jar from a failed science experiment into a living bakery. Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis produces overwhelmingly lactic acid, the mellow, yogurt-like sourness that defines world-class bread. And its presence does something incredible to yeast. The acid it generates is the exact environment that wild Saccharomyces strains find irresistible. When the pH drops below 4, the yeast population explodes. At that point, the 100-to-1 ratio flips from a warning into a partnership. The bacteria prime the home. The yeast move in and raise the roof. This is not competition. It is symbiosis. The bacteria consume maltose, a sugar the yeast cannot use, and expel acid. The yeast consume glucose, leaving the maltose for the bacteria. Neither starves. Both thrive, and together they create a starter that can double in volume in 4 hours and hold that structure for 12. Modern commercial yeast does one thing fast. It inflates. It gives you none of the 50-plus volatile flavor compounds that a wild starter develops during a long fermentation. Compounds that taste like honey, toasted nuts, browned butter, fresh cream, all of them created by the slow biological machinery you can build in a mason jar. But you have to feed it, and feeding is where the century of forgotten knowledge turns every detail into a crisis. Here are the rules that work. Use whole grain rye or wheat flour for at least the first week. The bran carries a higher load of wild spores. Use unchlorinated water. A single drop of municipal chlorine can stun the bacteria for days. Keep it warm, between 70 and 80 degrees, and feed it at the same time every single day. Consistency is the signal. A missed feeding in the first week can crash the pH so fast the yeast never establish. In the beginning, discard half and feed 1-to-1 by weight. 50 grams starter, 50 grams flour, 50 grams water. Stir, cover loosely. Mark the level with a rubber band and walk away. On day 2, nothing. On day 3, maybe a few bubbles. On day 4, a false rise that will break your heart when it falls. On day 5, a quiet smell like overripe fruit. On day 6, the surface of the starter will dome, crack, and climb 2 inches above that rubber band in under 6 hours. That is the moment the yeast have achieved stable dominance. Not a single cell arrived from anywhere but the flour and the air you breathe. Now, if you are looking at this calendar and thinking you do not have 7 days of patience for bread, I need you to hear the number 50. Bread baked with wild yeast, contains at least 50 distinct flavor compounds. Bread baked with commercial yeast contains fewer than 10. The difference is not trivial. It is the difference between a meal and a memory, and it used to be the only bread anyone ever ate. When you feed a starter, you are not just mixing flour and water. You are maintaining the same biological line that sustained Rome, that traveled the Silk Road, that crossed the Atlantic in the hulls of ships. That continuity is not poetry, it is microbiology. A single starter, if fed daily, never dies. It can be divided and shared. The piece of Boudin's 170-year-old starter is now in hundreds of kitchens across the country, still fermenting the same way. Your starter will do the same, but you have to pass the first real test. The dough. The moment you combine your weeks-old starter with flour, water, and salt, everything you have built faces a single verdict. Either the dough rises, or you find out what went wrong. And the number one reason a first loaf fails has nothing to do with the starter's strength. It has everything to do with time. A commercial yeast dough rises in under 2 hours, and every recipe written since the 1930s assumes that speed. Wild yeast needs 4 to 12 hours. The same recipe that gives you a pillowy, high-rise loaf with packet yeast will produce a flat, gummy disc with a starter if you follow the clock instead of the dough. Because the first rule your grandmother knew and you have never been taught is that a sourdough loaf is finished rising not when a timer beeps, but when it passes a single test. Poke it with a floured finger. If the dough springs back instantly, it needs more time. If it springs back slowly and leaves a shallow dent, it is ready. That dent is the dough exhaling. You are not baking on a human schedule. You are baking on a microbial one. But even if you nail the timing, the second wall is waiting, and it hides in the moment you put the bread into the oven. A wild yeast loaf comes out of the Banneton wetter, heavier and softer than anything you have handled. The first instinct is to add more flour during shaping. That instinct destroys the crumb. You need a high hydration dough, roughly 75% water to flour, to give the bacteria room to keep working and to generate the steam that expands the loaf in the first 10 minutes of heat. Oven spring, the final explosive rise that lifts the ear of a scored boule, depends entirely on that trapped water flashing into vapor inside the gluten matrix. If you dried the surface with extra flour, the crust seals too fast, the spring dies, and the inside is a tight, sad sponge. This is the moment most novice bakers quit. They blame the starter. They blame the recipe. They never blame the fact that they were taught to treat dough like Play-Doh, not like a living structure. But here is the truth that alters everything past a single loaf. When you finally bite into bread leavened only by wild yeast, you are eating bread your body already recognizes. Modern industrial bread, even the artisan loaves in grocery stores, are fermented so fast they leave behind a protein called amylase trypsin inhibitor and a pile of intact gluten peptides. Natural long fermentation, the kind that takes 12 hours, reduces those peptides by over 90%. The lactic acid bacteria break apart the proteins that cause bloating, brain fog, and the low-level chronic inflammation now linked to almost every autoimmune disorder. This is not a wellness trend. It is a chemistry set that humans spent 6,000 years adapting to, then discarded in under 100. And the discarding was not an accident. In the 1920s, the United States Department of Agriculture launched a national campaign called the Better Bread Movement. Its stated goal: eliminate unpalatable, unpredictable homemade bread and replace it with uniform, factory-made white loaves baked with commercial yeast. Bakers were trained to abandon natural leavens. Home economists published pamphlets calling sourdough starters a bacterial hazard. By 1930, the marriage between the flour industry, the new yeast monopolies, and the government had scrubbed wild fermentation from the American kitchen. The foil packet was not just convenient, it was a finished product of a deliberate re-education of an entire population. And it worked so thoroughly that when the pandemic hit in 2020 and millions of people were stuck at home trying to bake, they had to rebuild the entire knowledge chain from scratch, using YouTube videos and century-old books that were never supposed to survive. And yet, those starters from 2020 are still alive today. That is the part nobody tells you. A sourdough starter does not die of old age. It dies only of neglect or heat. Kept in a refrigerator and fed once a week, it will outlive you. I know a baker in Anchorage who still bakes with a starter carried over the Chilkoot Trail during the Klondike Gold Rush. I know a family in Vermont who feeds a culture their great-grandmother brought from Poland in 1912. The bread you bake this weekend could be the same bread your granddaughter sets on her table 60 years from now. And we are going to bake that first loaf right now. We are going to bake that first loaf right now. Start the night before you plan to mix. Pull your starter from the fridge, discard most of it, and feed it equal weights of flour and water. Leave it on the counter. By morning, it will have tripled, and the surface will be domed, glossy, and webbed with bubbles. That starter is now at peak strength and ready to work. Into a large bowl, place 500 grams of bread flour, 350 grams of warm water, and 100 grams of the active starter. Mix it with your hand until no dry spots remain. Cover the bowl and walk away for 45 minutes. This rest is called autolyse, and it does in silence what no amount of kneading can accomplish. The flour proteins hydrate fully, gluten bonds form without effort, and the dough becomes stretchable, pliable, and alive. When you return, sprinkle 12 grams of salt across the top, and use a wet hand to fold the dough over itself 4 times. The salt tightens the gluten immediately, and the first fold teaches the dough structure. Now begins bulk fermentation. For the next 4 hours, you will do almost nothing except wait and fold. Every 30 minutes, lift one edge of the dough, stretch it high without tearing, and fold it over the center. Turn the bowl a quarter turn, and repeat 3 times. With each round, the dough tightens. Gas pockets multiply inside, and the surface begins to smooth. By the 3rd hour, it will jiggle like a water balloon when you shake the bowl. Sometime in the 4th hour, that poke test you learned about earlier will tell you it is finished bulking. The dough will be nearly double, domed, and a floured finger will leave a dent that slowly springs halfway back. Scrape the dough onto a lightly floured counter. Shape it with the gentleness of a mother handling a newborn. Do not punch it down. Do not force out the gas. That gas is your crumb. Fold the edges to the center, like a letter. Roll it into a tight boule and seal the bottom seam with a pinch. Place it seam side up into a floured banneton cover and either let it proof at room temperature for 2 hours or refrigerate overnight for a slower, deeper flavor. I prefer the fridge. The cold proof gives the bacteria extra time to work and the dough stiffer, easier to score. Set your oven to 475 degrees with a Dutch oven inside. When the pot is screaming hot, remove the lid, flip the dough out of the banneton onto parchment, and score the surface with a single confident slash at a shallow angle. The blade must not hesitate. A deep, decisive score gives the expanding steam a path to escape. It is the seam that will become the ear. Lower the dough into the hot pot, cover and seal the oven. In the first 10 minutes, trapped steam blasts the dough, delaying crust formation and allowing one final explosive rise. At 20 minutes, remove the lid. The loaf will have sprung high, the ear curled back, the crust pale gold and already crackling. Give it another 25 minutes uncovered, until the shell deepens to mahogany and a tap on the bottom sounds hollow as a wooden drum. Pull it out, place it on a wire rack. Do not cut it yet. If you slice it now, the starches will not have set, and the crumb will gum beneath the knife. Wait 1 full hour. I know, this is the real test of patience. Then make the cut. The crust will shatter under the bread knife in crisp shards. Inside, the crumb will be open, honeycombed with irregular holes, each one a fossil of a gas bubble exhaled by microbes that have been doing this work for 6,000 years. The color will be cream touched with gray and faint lavender, the sign of proper lactic fermentation. Tear off a piece. The first flavor is not sour. It is toasted grain, then malt, then a faint buttery finish. The acid is gentle, present only as a clean brightness on the sides of your tongue. This bread tastes like a whole food because it is. And here is what you have really built. In the refrigerator behind you, the half cup of starter you did not use is still alive, and it will remain alive next week and next year. You can dry a tablespoon of it on a sheet of parchment. In 3 days, it will be hard as a cracker. Break it into chips, store them in an envelope, and a decade from now, you can mix them with flour and water and wake the same culture back to life. Even if you lose everything else, the dry flakes in that drawer contain the entire inheritance. This is not a recipe you learned today. It is a lineage you entered, and I want to show you the one mistake that kills more starters than anything else, so yours never becomes one of them. The mistake is stopping. A starter dies from neglect, not from age. Feed it once a week. Even if you haven't baked in a month, keep it cold, keep it covered, and that half cup of bubbling culture will still be alive when you reach for it next season. That tiny routine is the whole difference between a dead jar and a lineage that outlives you. For 6,000 years, this was not a hobby. It was not a weekend project. It was the daily act of handing life forward, one scrap of dough from yesterday tucked into tomorrow's flour. When you keep a starter, you enter that same unbroken chain of someone who kneaded before dawn and pulled bread from an oven that had no timer, only instinct. They are gone. The bread remains. If this made sense to you, hit subscribe, not for the algorithm, but because the next video picks up exactly here, and I will show you how to turn that same starter into pizza, pancakes, and a loaf that needs exactly 10 minutes of hands-on work. And if you want the full printed guide with the feeding schedule, the flour blends, and every recipe we just walked through, there is a special offer through the link in the first pinned comment. Thank you for baking with me. I will see you in the next one.